Good morning, everyone. Very good Monday morning to you. Hope you had a great weekend. I certainly did. Busy, hectic. That's just kind of the way life is, though, isn't it? But anyway, it's great to be back with you. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And this is what I call my morning musings, as I share a cup of coffee with you and a few thoughts from Scripture. Just recently, I did a little series on the last days, and I forgot to address a question from one of the viewers that has to do with Daniel chapter 8. Now, in the series, I stated, perhaps overstated, that when we see the term last days, it refers to the last days of Israel's age. There are a few exceptions to that in Scripture. Sometimes in Scripture, not all that many cases, I would add, the term last days or latter days means after this, in the coming days. There are a few isolated texts that so clearly identify what it means by the latter days or the last days that it does not refer to the last days of Israel, but it refers in fact to the last days of another kingdom. And Daniel chapter 8 is a classic example of this. Now, for time consideration, let me keep this very brief. Daniel was writing in the days of the Babylonian Empire. He saw a vision of a ram followed by a goat. The ram had two horns. The goat destroyed the ram with two horns. The goat had one major horn. That horn was shattered, followed by four horns, followed by a little horn. Did you get that? So what we have here is a progression, and Daniel was very deeply troubled by the vision, and he prayed to understand. And in Daniel chapter 8, 13 and following, Daniel was given the interpretation of the vision. Now here's what's very important. You know, anytime we have the interpretation of a vision by Scripture, that really ought to settle it. How some people have gone to Daniel chapter 8 and says it speaks of the end of time simply overlooks and violates what the text itself says. Let me explain by that. The angel came to Daniel, an angel Gabriel gave him the interpretation of the vision. Notice, the ram which you saw, having the two horns, are the kings of Media and Persia. Now, folks, we don't have any argument room here. So the vision starts not in the days of the Babylonian Empire. This vision is concerned with the days following Babylon, beginning with Medo-Persia. So even though Daniel was alive and writing and had the vision in the days of the Babylonian Empire, it did not involve the Babylonian Empire. Now watch this. Daniel 8:21. The male goat is the kingdom of Greece. End of story. I mean, there's really no argument about it. This must be Alexander. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. As for the broken horn and the four that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not in its power. Well, historically, we know Alexander the Great died, an untimely death we might add, and his kingdom was divided by his 4 generals. All of this resulted in what we know as the Ptolemy and the Seleucids and the division. Well, now watch this. In the latter day of their kingdom, whose kingdom? The 4 kings that came out of Alexander. So we are specifically given the identification of this last days period. It's the last days of the Grecian Empire. It's not even the last days of Rome. Most assuredly is not the last days of Israel, And by the way, it most assuredly is not the last days of time or the Christian age. In the latter days of their kingdom. Their kingdom was the kingdom of Greece. In the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. And he goes ahead and describes that. And this king would make war with the saints, but he would be broken without human hand. Daniel 8:25. Now I want you to notice something that's interesting and critical here. Daniel was living in the time of Belshazzar, i.e. the Babylonian Empire, in whose days, of course, the Medes and the Persians had destroyed him. But the vision concerns the Medes and the Persians, followed by the Greeks, going to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. He is this little horn here. He's the one who shall destroy fearfully. But remember, this is the last days of the Grecian Empire. But notice that from the time of Daniel, writing in the Babylonian Empire, to the breaking of the power of Antiochus Epiphanes, Daniel 8:24, or 8:26, excuse me, the vision of the evenings and the mornings which told is true, seal up the vision. It refers to many days in the future. Now Daniel's vision, which spanned Medo-Persia to the end of Antiochus Epiphanes, was approximately 386 years. Okay? Daniel was told that was a long time. So he was supposed to seal up the vision. You know what? That tells us that God can tell time. But here's the key point. While Daniel 8 speaks of the time of the end, and while it speaks of the latter days, it so clearly, undeniably, and specifically identifies this last days, period, as the last days of the Grecian Empire. And guess what? Antiochus Epiphanes was the last great king of the Grecian Empire. The Romans put an end to him. They didn't kill him. He was broken without hand. But they most assuredly put an end to his attempts to conquer Egypt, for instance, to continue his conquering ways. Daniel 8 was fulfilled beautifully in history. Those were the last days, not the last days of the eschatological end and the coming of the Lord in judgment at the end of the age. It was the last days of the Grecian Empire. I hope that answers that question. Thanks so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. Don't forget now, if you want to know an awful lot more about the last days, order my book, The Last Days Identified. Go to my websites, www.eschatology.org, www.bibleprophecy.com. Order the book, mention that you saw the offer on YouTube, and I'll refund your shipping. That'll save you $5. So take advantage of that. So again, thanks so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. We'll see you on the flip side.